Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings together prominent New Yorkers with faculty and students of the Ed T. Rakowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. With the departure of he who must not be named from the White House, it's amazing how the temperature connected to politics and civic affairs has dropped to levels considered normal prior to 2017. But the fact that President Biden has made politics boring again does not hide the extremely high stakes as he and the Democrats, who narrowly control both houses of Congress, grapple with issues such as a stimulus package, immigration reform, mass transit funding, affordable housing, climate change, and criminal justice that will determine to a large degree how quickly and how far we in New York can recover from the ravages of the pandemic. In Albany and City Hall, and by extension, the neighborhoods and workplaces of the city, much depends on how negotiations in the state and national capitals wind up. This all comes at a time of high uncertainty in our local politics, with a multi-candidate field running for mayor from all kinds of perspectives, and a governor whose ability to ride roughshod over those who try to resist his political charms is severely wounded by the response to revelations connected to COVID deaths of nursing home patients. We're joined by four New Yorkers who take part in and analyze our political and civic affairs to assess where we are in the early months of the Biden administration and what it means in the real world. Amanda Septimo is a newly elected Democratic State Assembly member representing the South Bronx. Carl Weisbrot is the former head of the city's Planning Commission and Economic Development Corporation and currently works as a senior advisor to HR&A advisors on housing planning and other issues. Ben Max is the executive editor of Gotham Gazette, which if you don't read every morning online, you should. And Laura Notmius is a member of the editorial board of one of my former journalistic homes, the Daily News. Amanda, let me begin with you. You're getting into the budget season. You're in the budget season now in Albany. You don't know what the final status of the stimulus bill is. You have great need and uncertain revenue. What's going on?
Well, Bob, first, thank you for having me, but I think you've really characterized it well. There's so many things in the air and so much remains unknown. But as a newly elected member, I know that there's a chorus of voices of new members and older members, I don't want to call them old because people are sensitive, but who recognize that there is a really big need to raise revenue, irrespective of what federal support looks like. We know that New York State has ongoing needs as it relates to funding. We have communities that have been severely underfunded for decades, and we've seen the impact of this neglect really play itself out during COVID in a way that's been really painful for places like the South Bronx. And so to that end, a lot of us are really focused on making sure that we're all stepping up to meet our need, not only in this year and in our recovery from the pandemic, but long term, and imagining whatever a just recovery means, ensuring that it doesn't mean going back to whatever was normal before, because it wasn't working for many parts of the state, including the South Bronx.
Carl, you've been in the civic wars for a long time, as have I. Because, Amanda references a lot of very, very progressive new members. There's a lot of pressure to raise taxes, to kind of tax our way out of the basically recession that we're in. Can we grow our way out of it? You've been through a few recessions. Nothing quite like this because they're all different. Where are we, and how does this work its way through?
Well, I think this is my sixth New York City crisis, and that goes back more than 50.
Excuse me, are these your fault? Do you think these crises?
No, the sixth one that I've lived through, none of them my fault. I disclaim responsibility for any of them, but this one for sure is the most complex for many reasons, and is, I think, the most difficult for the city and state to grapple with. I think we can raise some taxes on the margins, but I don't think we can tax our way out of it. And while I'm a great believer in growth, that growth is going to take a long time to develop. So I don't think we're going to be able in the short run to grow our way out of it either. And so I think the real challenge, and this is one of the reasons that I think this particular crisis is going to be so difficult, and in this respect, I totally agree with Amanda, is that this is the first crisis, at least that I've been through, where there is such an acute recognition that how we deal with it has to address the issues of inequity and that has been so underscored by this pandemic. And so the real challenge for the city, I think, is going to be how to do less with more or more with less, and do it in an equitable way, because we're going to get a lot of help from Washington. That's a lot different from many of our previous crises when we had an unsympathetic Washington administration. I think now we have a sympathetic Washington administration. But as Amanda says, I don't think that's going to be enough. The city's financial situation is acute, but the state's financial situation is perhaps dire or more acute than the city's. And so one big issue that we're going to face is how this budget is and how this fiscal challenge is going to be whacked up between the city and state. That's always an issue, but especially an issue now.
Ben, for those of us who love politics in part as theater, there's an awful lot of theater going on in our politics and politics does impinge on how things get done. You have obviously a very complicated mayor's race. You have a governor who was wounded and, was wounded within the last week, even this day that we're taping, he's been further wounded. Does this politics interfere with is it an opportunity? Is it a problem? Especially when you factor in, we have Chuck Schumer as the Senate Majority Leader in Washington. And, Hakeem Jeffries, personal politics, hopefully is the next speaker in Washington. Analyze this politically. It's a very bizarre time.
Right. I mean, I think there's challenges around the fact that you have a lame duck administration in the city. But it does also open up Mayor de Blasio, as we've already seen, for making perhaps some last-ditch efforts at some things like putting forward more aggressive property tax reform and some other things, or being a little bit more bold on school desegregation, for example. But so much of this is going to come back to the federal and state governments and what trickles down to New York City. And the governor facing these twin scandals of the nursing home situation, as well as sexual harassment allegations, and this larger picture that's being developed that people have known for a long time, but there's more and more voices now coming in. He's really facing probably the most challenging period of his 10 plus years in office right now. Is that an opportunity for the state in some ways, and the city? Yes, because he's obviously going to want to get a lot done to change the story, but it also definitely creates some risk, because you have this developing more adversarial relationship between the legislature and the governor is known to sort of hunker down and bunker down and take on his challengers and those criticizing him. So I think there's a lot that we don't know that's going to pan out here. But one of the most important things for New York City is the way that the state budget is crafted, and whether to fix the state budget challenge that is more serious than the city challenge, if the state is taking more of the money that comes from the federal government than the city would like to see.
Laura, Laura, the news has been very, I think, done the best analysis of the ongoing pandemic and the economic crisis, the pandemic crisis, the racial justice crisis. These are, separable, but they're also intertwined. Where do you see, combine these three. How do you see us moving forward? Do we have the political will and the political skill to do this?
I think we are obviously we're in a serious crisis moment that is, things are coming to a head. One thing that I think we are seeing is that the politicians vying for office as mayor and vying to be in the state assembly and in the state senate are increasingly aware of sort of the structural foundation of a lot of the problems that we have in New York City and in New York State. And part of the problem is that they only have control over things that happen in the state legislature or in the city budget. And so many of the problems that we have stem from the way that federal policies work or don't work with city and state policies, how funding streams work, how NYCHA is funded or defunded, how long-term care is not funded for older people, and the states have to pony up their own money to pay for our older residents, how all different entitlement programs, the hoops that you have to jump through to get funding, to get aid, to get welfare. There's just this increasing recognition of what the problem is, and it doesn't match the power to do anything about it. I think that that's a problem in a lot of different states, not just in New York City. And I don't know how that's going to resolve itself. But I do think we're at a moment of racial and economic awakening where if the federal government doesn't take the opportunity to sort of fundamentally restructure certain systems and rebuild them in ways that are more sustainable and fair, then I don't know what the future is going to look like for the country.
You know, Amanda, they've all made reference to the, inequalities that have long underlaid economics and politics and housing and healthcare. You just introduced a bill about environmental racism, about polluting institutions, particularly in Hunts Point, if I remember correctly. And I've been working on an issue involved with diabetes. The diabetes rates, the COVID complications and mortality among diabetics is just skyrocketing compared to other things. How do you wrestle with the economic collapse at a time of short revenue and try to deal with the kinds of inequalities that everybody's been talking about and that you're talking about?
Well, I'll tell you, Bob, I think that it's really interesting. I think one of the only silver linings to come of COVID is the idea that finally the issues that communities like the South Bronx and other communities around the state have been yelling about for decades are so brought to the surface that they just can't be ignored anymore. And we all understand, to Laura's point, that all of these systems interact in a way that we're being irresponsible if we don't acknowledge the harm that our policies are creating when they're meant to do good for people. And so I think that that's under that framework, that even the notion of working to tax our way out of issues is interesting, right? Because I think we're living in this world where COVID feels like an impetus, but the truth is that wealthy folks have been getting tax breaks for a long time and have been paying tax rates that are preferable to poorer folks for a long time and have been experiencing this really tax-friendly New York, maybe that's going a bit far, but a tax-friendlier New York for many years. And so we're in this dire moment of need, and that's not new, but we're also, I think, because these issues have been brought to the surface in this way, we're also confronting this really unique opportunity, again, to Laura's point, to say, okay, we know now with certainty, despite having known, now we can't ignore that these issues all intersect and that all of the levels of government intersect, and we have to be thoughtful about how we choose to recover. And to me, that means making sure that communities that have been at the front line of impact for decades of neglect get to be at the front line of decision making and at the front line of policy making when we think about, again, what a just recovery means, because that could mean anything. And depending on who you are, you could have lived a different coronavirus, right? Coronavirus looked really different in the South Bronx than it did even in parts of Manhattan. And I think those are inequities that we have to grapple with, not only as we diagnose the problems, but as we thoughtfully think about solutions as well.
Anybody, by the way, jump in. I mean, Ben, is this, is this an opportunity? Do we seize the opportunity? We've had opportunities before and kick the ball down the, think about transit, think about transit funding. We've had these challenges and we basically kick the ball down the field and figure we'll deal with it later. Now is later.
Well, that's exactly actually where I was going to say something, is that you have this sort of overlay of a lot of talk about that there should be a different policy programmatic approach going forward on a whole number of issues, and then you have just this basic need where an influx of money, influx of help, an influx of food security, housing security, just basic cash in people's pockets and bank accounts is so needed. And so there is the risk of sort of just bandaging this emergency with all this money that's going to come from Washington, most likely, and then not necessarily reckoning with all the other things that have been further exposed in the last year. And so that there is a big risk of that, especially when you consider the fact that you're talking about a transition year in the mayoral administration. There's a great opportunity there for the next mayor, but it depends, what the playing field looks like as that transition happens. But I do think it's enormously important to look at what decisions are made at the state level here in this upcoming budget, and then probably the next one as really pivotal in terms of where New York heads as this money comes in, and as there is hopefully a sense of real recovery with people being vaccinated, hopefully more commerce and business happening, hopefully a return of tourism. Is it that we're mostly just sort of putting the Band-Aid on and going back to the way things to the way things were, or are there a lot of new ways of doing things that are implemented at both the state and the city levels?
I believe that probably all of us would agree on things that the federal government should do to help not only New York, but to help other major cities around the country. And I dare say we wouldn't have much disagreement among us, maybe a little, but not that much disagreement among us about a program that would be a federal program that would be highly beneficial to New York, to the state and to the city. Though how much of that program is realizable is at the moment very unclear. But I think that we can certainly I believe that whatever is realizable, and I hope there's going to be a lot, it's not going to be enough. And I always remember one of my mentors from the 1975 fiscal crisis, John Zuccotti, saying, where is it written in the Constitution that the city is responsible for homelessness? Just when the homelessness crisis was first coming into its full impact. And the fact is, no place assigns homelessness to cities, except the federal government and the state government roll over these problems to the point where the city is ultimately the place where these problems end up being addressed, hopefully solved, but not generally solved because the city doesn't have the money to do it. And so it really is ultimately, in my view, a question of what the city can do, because the federal government and the state government have the power to direct what the city can do, and also have the power to limit the amount of money that comes into the city. And so that's a real challenge, and it's going to be a real challenge for the next mayor. I don't think we can tax our way out of it because, among other things, we still have a SALT provision of the Trump tax cuts, which put a cap on tax deductions for New York high earners, and they are very mobile. And if they leave, that's a problem. And in addition, if those high earners, if we don't attract high earners and retain high earners, ultimately revenues to the city will decline. So is there an inflection point? Maybe, but I think we have to be pretty sensitive about taxing. And I think we have to also recognize that growth is going to take some time. So it's really going to be a question, I think the rubber is going to hit the road between the state and the city largely, and what the city is going to be able to do to address how city government functions with the next mayor.
Pardon my age, but like Carl, I remember the 1975 crisis. And so I kind of want to ask this to both Laura and Amanda. In 1975, the state could take the lead in bailing us out. The state had a much stronger fiscal condition than the city did. That's not the case now. And one of the issues, I've seen it in a number of issues I've worked with, in particular health issues, and you see it now where the governor is talking about taking some of the money from the MTA, transit money, and diverting it into things to help cover his incredibly sizable COVID-caused deficits. Money does have to flow through the, does have to flow through the state. There are moves now I can't remember if it was de Blasio said it or some of the people in Congress, to try to give that money directly to the city and bypass the state so the state doesn't grab it out of there. I can't remember if the news is opined on this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just in the decade that I've been covering city and state budgets and politics, it's been really remarkable to realize the degree to which so much that essentially the mayor gets blamed for, the city council gets blamed for here in New York City is really the responsibility of the state, or is a decision that flows through the state, even housing decisions. And if you talk to a lot of different experts who are talking about, for example, the homelessness crisis, which I think a lot of people these days are pointing out is also a housing crisis and a mental health crisis and a criminal justice crisis and a race crisis. You realize that some of this can be traced back to the deinstitutionalization that flowed from the federal government through the state government, which sets the Medicaid rates at which, you know, different providers of healthcare and services are reimbursed for taking care of people, which creates incentives or disincentives to actually provide the care that people need. And you realize that a lot of the dynamics of what is creating, particularly the increase in single adult homeless people in New York City, might be reasonably tied to a lack of like SROs or supportive housing or mental health services or any number of things that is just not, as Carl pointed out, is not entirely the city's fault or responsibility, and is not really something that the city could pay for or fund or address entirely on its own. And a lot of the decisions have to get made at the state level, and there's just so little attention or so little ability in the public to connect where the decisions are made with what needs to get done. For whatever reason, it's very difficult to break through.
Amanda, even setting aside the toxic relationship between the governor and the mayor, you've got this incredible institutional problem where we can't put in a red light camera unless the state says, okay, you can do it. I mean, Albany could vote New York City out of existence. We are totally legally a creation of the state. Is there a consciousness of that? Now you have a strongly Democratic state Senate. It's, now it's kind of a one-party rule up there within the legislature, which it wasn't. How do you look at delivering the bacon? I mean, mass transit, the most recent, issue.
Yeah. No, so, I am not here to mince words. I am here to accept all responsibility for the state. I think everybody on this panel is spot on that the state has a lot of responsibility and a lot of power, and runs away from that responsibility and power and has for decades. Love or hate the primary that happened between Governor Cuomo and Cynthia Nixon in 2018. The phrase Cuomo's MTA was born of it. And I think, to Laura's point, it helped people understand that there is a lot of power vested in Albany as it relates to the ins and outs of daily life in New York City. And I think that, to your point earlier, Bob, I think in this moment, the state has to decide what kind of state we're going to live in. And Ben was making this point before. Are we going to go back to a state where we essentially say, if you are poor and can't afford healthcare, you're going to die. If you have to work this lower wage job, you might die. If we get into another pandemic for whatever reason and we decide that making money is more important than your life, you might die, right? And all of those things sound really crude and really heinous, but that's the world that we live in. And that's the decisions. Those are the decisions that we've seen play out over the course of this pandemic. And so now I think the questions are, do we all think that everyone should pay and invest fairly in creating the New York that we all deserve? Because for a long time, so many people have been paying to create this New York that we've all been living in, and they've been paying for it not only with sweat equity, but also now, unfortunately, with their lives, and it's just not fair.
We're talking, when you talk about economic equity and you talk about all these economic issues and how they're intertwined, immigration is critically intertwined in all of these issues. They're now, we now see, frankly, a humane and pragmatic program finally coming out of the Biden administration, even though immigration agreements collapse on the flimsiest of grounds. You see candidates for mayor talking about how non-citizens, documented immigrants, should be allowed to vote in municipal elections, which they used to be able to do in voting for school board elections. But, bringing tens, hundreds of thousands of people out of the shadows into the tax system, into the formal civic infrastructure of this city is not just an immigration issue. It is an economic issue. It's obviously a social justice issue.
It's also a representation issue. I mean, what the Trump administration did over the past 4 years, in a sense, forcing undocumented people into the shadows, I'm sure has hurt our census count tremendously and may cost us in Washington and also in Albany in terms of our representation once the 2020 census results come out. And immigration has been a critical part of our economic success story over centuries. I mean, we thrive on immigration, and we thrive on a culture of opening our doors to everyone. And I do hope that that's one area where the Biden administration can make substantial transformation.
I'm pretty skeptical on immigration reform, given how tight things are in Congress. But hopefully, Carl's right that there will be a breakthrough of some kind, which could hugely benefit New York. I mean, I'm particularly bullish on the New York economic revival. I actually think with an expected massive infusion of federal funds, the vaccination happening, and this just massive amount of sort of pent up money for people who haven't lost wages and income and interest in activity, travel. I actually am pretty bullish on the, broadly speaking, the New York economic comeback. But again, the question becomes, who's going to really benefit? What are the impacts going to be on communities that have suffered the most and been marginalized forever? And what that's going to look like. And that's where smart policy at all three levels of government is really going to make the difference. I think the conversations that are happening in Washington, Albany, and New York City are, the rubber's going to have to meet the road in terms of people being willing to take some real political hits to do what's right. And we saw how long it took, for example, to get congestion pricing passed in Albany. Then they couldn't get approval for it in Washington. We're seeing how long it's taking, even though there's consensus on legalizing adult use marijuana, we're seeing how long it takes to actually get a deal done on that. The future of NYCHA is a nightmare right now, and people need to make really tough decisions as well as allocating the funding. So there's huge areas that need smart policy as well as a whole bunch of funding. But broadly speaking, I feel pretty good about, at least right now, I feel fairly optimistic about sort of the rebirth of the city.
I agree with Ben. Before the election, I was like basically in tears many nights, talking to various budget experts about what we could do to turn the city around and make up for revenue shortfalls if Trump were to be elected again. And a lot of people's response was, it's not looking good. This is really, things are looking really bleak if he's reelected. He's put in this like system or was trying to find ways to just pull money from the city anyway, even before the pandemic. And now that I'm allowed to have an opinion on the editorial board, when it went the other way, I was very excited for New York City and for New Yorkers, because it meant that we had a shot and we would at least have some material to play with potentially to fill in whatever gaps, and we weren't going to be in this like downward spiral. I'm feeling pretty good.
we're going to go to questions from the students in the audience in a minute, but one of these intertwined issues, and Amanda, I want to go to you for this because you just introduced this what I'm calling an environmental racism bill, but the environmental justice, the climate change issue, going, on a national level, going back into the Paris Accords, rejoining the world, has implications for how we come out of this as well. Talk a little bit, just a minute or two about that bill and why it's important and how it fits into this broader issue.
Sure. So I think environmental racism is a great phrase, and you should use it as many times as you can, because the reality is that there are a lot of race issues that go into environmental issues. Environmental justice communities throughout New York are usually communities of color. And the reality is, so this bill specifically looks at air toxins and overall improving air quality. In the South Bronx, we've got the highest asthma rate in the nation. And that's through no sort of accident. That is sort of policy decisions over years and years, and an overemphasis on industry and not enough of a focus on how that impacts living, breathing people. But overall, I think, I feel like we can all breathe a little bit easier, no pun intended. But I think rejoining the Paris Accords, on the state level, we're one step closer to guaranteeing the constitutional right in New York to clean water and clean air. That question will go before voters in November. And so I think generally I'm feeling really optimistic about the fact that, once again, climate change is something that we're sort of finally, it seems, moving out of the full denial phase and now moving into the realm of how do we craft policy that is responsible, that is thoughtful, and that, again, is accounting for the harm that has happened to communities that have been neglected for decades on end.
We're gonna go to questions from the students. We haven't touched on, there's just so much we can deal with in it now. We haven't touched on schools and the problems of remote learning, non-remote learning. I'll have to wait for another discussion. But let me bring in Ernesto Malave Jr., who's gonna give us some of the questions from the students. How are you, Ernesto?
Good. Our first question today comes from Valeria Cruz from Queens College. Most of the United States is in critical need of an infrastructural overhaul. How can this administration address our crumbling city's needs?
One of the issues is, Carl, let me start with you, because infrastructure is classically one of the ways you grow your way out of a recession.
Yes, and I certainly hope and expect that we will see an infrastructure bill coming out of the Biden administration. There are a huge number of infrastructure needs in the city, and not only deferred maintenance on whether it's the BQE or finally getting the gateway tunnels to Penn Station built, but also you're absolutely right that it is a stimulus that puts people to work, that generates a lot of money for our economy. And the New York region is probably the most intensive infrastructure region in the country, if not among in the world. And we desperately need infrastructure aid from, and a big infrastructure bill from Washington. Frankly, the one thing I would have expected from the Trump administration and from Donald Trump would have been an infrastructure bill. I'm really quite shocked that at least that he couldn't do. But I will say that I hope the city, and I don't know for sure, but I assume the city, like other cities in this country, are putting together a very solid list of infrastructure projects that are, as they say, shovel ready in the best sense of the word, so that they can take advantage of an infrastructure bill. And by the way, I do think that we're benefited, obviously, by having the majority leader in the Senate from New York, and also now the Deputy Transportation Secretary in Polly Trottenberg as the deputy there, who knows our infrastructure, or at least our transportation infrastructure needs very well.
Ben, you follow a lot of this kind of infrastructure funding. How does it go from idea to the, from the planning board to the streets? Do you share that optimism? I mean, we haven't had, I haven't mentioned Trump's name, only Carl has, but we haven't had, he had 86 infrastructure weeks that didn't yield any infrastructure.
I think I have a bit more optimism about infrastructure than immigration, just because of how much, how many times we've seen immigration talk lead to nowhere. But hopefully both will happen. I do think infrastructure feels quite likely to happen. I don't know that I share Carl's optimism about how ready the city is, and I hope they're getting ready, and we'll check in with them about that. But there's obviously talk about everything from Gateway to just the other day, Senator Schumer, Majority Leader Schumer, talking about the possible expansion of the subway in Brooklyn, Utica Ave. And then everything from those projects to storm resiliency, sewer upgrades, all the stuff that people barely like to talk about. All those things need to be on a massive list. And I think there's a lot of room for securing federal funding for those things. And at this point, optimism abounds, I think, in terms of the flow of federal money out of Washington. But, the way those deals get ultimately crafted, they could get scaled down based on, what the split looks like in the Senate right now.
And by the way, Laura mentioned this earlier, but really NYCHA is infrastructure. And this was at one point, this was initially a federal responsibility to begin with. And the federal government sort of tossed it to the city without providing any money, just providing responsibility to the city. And high up, I assume, and should be high up on the city's list of needs in infrastructure is the repair of NYCHA.
I will tell you that, and I do want to go to Amanda on this, that when I came back to cover Brooklyn for New York Newsday in 1987, I realized that it was the 30th anniversary of Linden Houses, because we moved into Linden Houses in East New York when it was brand new in 1957, and I went back and looked. And to Carl's point, in the 50s, post-war, the federal government was funding 15,000 what we would now call affordable units in this city a year. And by the later years of the Reagan administration, and it hasn't changed that much since, they were supporting 500 units a year. So,
and in the 50s, 100% of NYCHA.
Yes, that's where I grew up. But you face, a lot of the projects. I know I'm supposed to use the word developments, but I'm proud to be from the projects in the South Bronx suffer from these, whether it's the paint, whether it's the heating systems, the cooling systems, the sheer problems that stem from lack of preventive maintenance.
So yeah, I'll tell you something. If you ask NYCHA, they explain that when NYCHA wants to demonstrate what federal disinvestment looks like, they actually bring folks to the South Bronx. And in Mott Haven, we have some of the highest concentration of public housing in the entire city. 3 in 4 people in Mott Haven live in public housing. And so I'm so happy to hear Laura and Carl call NYCHA an infrastructure project, because it is. And it's not only an opportunity for growth, but it's an opportunity to do the right thing. Folks are living in conditions that I think none of us can really believe are real, but they are real. And these are people's lives every single day. And so I'm hopeful that infrastructure will mean a huge transformation for NYCHA. But I also, to Ben's point, hope that it will mean an investment in a greener future for New York. We have all sorts of climate sort of focused commitments that we have to meet in terms of renewable energy, in terms of spending money in impacted communities, and infrastructure, again, doesn't always just mean transportation and building buildings. It can also mean solar panels. It can mean figuring out what new ways to grow renewable energy mean, and so many other things. And again, I think this is just New York's real opportunity. This is probably the closest to a clean slate we'll get. Real opportunity to say, okay, what is the place that we want to live in, and how are we going to spend money to get there?
And urban farming. I'm actually quite interested in urban farming. Let me go to Ernesto and see if we have another question.
Yes, we do. Our next question is from Sadaf Chowdhury of Brooklyn College. How will Biden's college-free plan affect CUNY?
Very good question. I mean, is anybody up on that? I am not. As I understand the plan is tuition-free in community colleges, the first 2 years of community college. I apologize, I'm not fully up, and is anybody up on what the plan is? Because, you know, he also has the issue of student debt, pardon me, on the back end, where, and, you know, some people, you know, the Bernie Sanders wing says we want $50,000 of student debt relief. Biden's talking about $10,000. You know, CUNY in particular is a huge economic engine in this city. I mean, I'm a Brooklyn College graduate, but I mean, you know, investing in students' abilities to go through community colleges, I think there's a renewed understanding of the job of the job generation coming out of students who get to go to community college. I don't know if anybody is up on this.
I'm not up on the plan, but I will say that recently, I think being spearheaded by Carines Reyes in the Assembly is a plan. It's a new deal for CUNY. I think that is the name, but it's an effort to make sure that we move to a CUNY system that is fully funded, that moves away from tuition fees for folks who go. That leads to staff being expanded, adjunct professors being paid fairly, and so many other things. And so I think overall, community colleges and CUNY overall, I think is certainly center focus for a lot of folks, including us on the state level.
I apologize that we're not up because I think it's a critical question, and we are on CUNY TV. I will say that when I went to Brooklyn College in the late 1960s, I graduated in 1970, it was free. We paid $30 a semester. And when they raised the $30 a semester to $50 a semester, we shut the school down. But I'm not advocating that because now I'm old. So let me,
just real quick on that, I can say, I mean, that Biden has a lot of plans that are focused on community colleges, which obviously are part of CUNY, and trying to make at least 2 years of community college free. But I believe he also has had something in his plans around allowing for use of scholarships and aid to be used not just for tuition, but also for other expenses, which are often barriers for students. So, you know, I know there was some discussion of that in the plan. And then also he had something around trying to make sure that all public colleges and universities were tuition free under a certain income threshold. I think it was a little over $100,000 a year, or something along those lines. So those are a few broad strokes I remember on that, but we should look at that more closely.
Ben, you are a treasure. You know, you're a little bit like what I used to say. When I was a reporter, I knew a little about a lot and a lot about nothing, but you know a lot about a lot. As we move forward through the pandemic, again, a triple whammy: COVID, the economic collapse, coming out of the George Floyd and some other murders, the reckoning with racial justice. Carl, you're the old hand here along with me. Have you ever had this kind of a coalescence?
No, as I said at the outset, I think this is by far the most complex crisis I've seen over the last half century, for all of those reasons. I do think, just to underscore what both Ben and Laura said, I am, in the long run, totally optimistic about the city's future. I have very bullish about it. I have no doubt about it. I think the challenge for the city is really in the short run, in the next 2-3 years. We'll probably get by the next year because of federal help. But the year after that, and the year after that, I think they're going to be very rough until tourism comes back. And that's going to take a while, because we think about the pandemic in terms of New York and the United States, and hopefully getting herd immunity here in the not too distant future and getting people vaccinated. But this is a worldwide pandemic, and until commerce opens up throughout the world, one of our key industries, tourism, is going to suffer, and is suffering badly. And that employs just hundreds of thousands of people, most of them people of color, and people who are not major wage earners. They're the workers in hotels and restaurants and taxi drivers and the like. They drive our economy, and that, to me, I think is an issue that we're going to have to face. And I'll just say one final thing, which is that we're entering a mayor's race right now. We're in a mayor's race right now. Whereas we've been discussing, one of the big issues is what is the relationship between the city and the state? What is the relationship between the mayor and the governor? And for all the importance of that, we haven't really seen that much from really any of the mayoral candidates yet.
Mhm.
If I could just say on that's one of my pet issues. For all of the years that I've been observing Governor Cuomo and his relationship with both Mayor Bloomberg and then Mayor de Blasio, the governor always wields more power than the mayor, and there's a power imbalance. And what I have seen Mayor de Blasio do a less than stellar job of doing during his time as mayor is strengthen and build relationships with people in his own party and the legislature, and make sure that lines of communication between himself and his administration and the other Democrats across the state are strong enough to be able to effectively counterbalance and be ready for whenever things become contentious with the governor. And I've been repeatedly surprised by that from Mayor de Blasio, that he would often seem to be leaving, his soft, fleshy underbelly exposed for the governor to,
Well, first of all, Mayor de Blasio being 7.5 feet tall, his soft underbelly is kind of sponge-like for, for a lot of those of us of normal height. I also wanted to say to give him his props, I believe it was de Blasio, maybe in his first inaugural, who talked about the Utica Avenue subway. That was actually something that de Blasio pushed early in his administration. Let me go to I'm sorry, go ahead. Do you want to say something quickly?
Two very quick things. I would say one, mentioning things is always nice, but I think, that's one of the lessons coming out of this administration is, really being able to act on things and get things done. And that goes to Laura's point about coalition building. And then to Carl's point quickly, I'll just say, I think with the questions around how quickly tourism and a lot of economic activity will come back is the intense need in the city for the combination of creativity and, like I was saying before, pushing through some of the political hurdles that come in the way of kind of taking bold action. And the merging of those two things are so essential right now in New York City for the future to create, in-city tourism at a level we've never seen before, that the city needs to lead, that type of thing.
Ernesto, are you there? Thank you, Sharon.
Yes, I am. So Cameron Azizli of the Borough of Manhattan Community College remarks and asks, we consistently hear about the inadequate conditions for people who are incarcerated, Rikers Island, for example. What kind of changes regarding criminal justice reform should we expect to see during the Biden presidency?
It's more than the Biden presidency. A lot of this happens at a local level. I mean, federal criminal policy is one thing, but the rubber meets the road on a local level. Amanda, this is something.
Yeah. So, what's interesting, one of the things that I didn't know, I'm learning new things every day in month 2 of being a state legislator. And one of the things that I hadn't realized is that state legislators have the power to walk into any, or the privilege rather, to walk into any detention center at any time. So that's a prison, a county jail, an ICE center, anything that you can name, they have the liberty to walk in. And so myself and some colleagues have really been sort of abusing that privilege, if you will, and visiting these centers unannounced, because anyone who spends any time incarcerated will tell you that when VIPs are visiting, you might as well be in a different place because things are so cleaned up and the presentation is so different. And I think top of mind for everyone everywhere, including folks incarcerated, is COVID and the real realities that come with people not being able to social distance, and all of those concerns are very real. And there's been a gross mishandling of incarcerated folks during this time. And now we're seeing that continue with the vaccine. But again, that's an issue I think that we're all sharing, that we're all feeling, even if not to the same degree. But in the time there, I think the state legislature has actually made some really interesting strides in criminal justice reform. I think now the challenge will be to keep going through. For folks who weren't paying attention, some of the things around bail reform got really contentious to the point where some of the progress that got made on bail reform had to be kind of rolled back. And I'm hopeful that legislators will continue to draw on the courage that got them to bail reform to begin with, to keep pushing through, because we still have a lot of room to grow, specifically around ending sort of indefinite detention in solitary confinement. There's a halt solitary confinement bill looking to limit it to 15 days. There's a lot of conversation around parole, and thinking about giving older folks who have spent a lot of time in prison the opportunity to be eligible for parole. And frankly, zooming out and looking at the parole system overall and how we get to a system that is focused on rehabilitation and healing. And I'm hopeful that in these conversations, we can start to recognize that, I think it's easy to think that folks end up in crime because of a series of bad decisions that they've made, but we don't own our responsibility in the life that we've given them that maybe would have driven them to some of those decisions. And I'm hopeful that from a public policy perspective, we can recognize that if I always send you to failing schools, if you're never paid a fair wage, if you have to work 3 jobs and still can't afford an apartment, then maybe life brings you to some places that are tough, and we have to own that role as well. And so what will the reforms be? I don't know, but I'm really hopeful that there will continue to be some, because I do think it could be easy to say we've done enough.
Let me bring in Ernesto for one last question. We have about 5 minutes left. Let's see if we can get something in.
Yes. Our final question for today is from Joseph Carousel of the College of Staten Island. And he asks, President Biden and his administration have mentioned sweeping new environmental policies that are referred to as the Green New Deal. With an exponentially worsening issues such as climate change and the reforms necessary to combat it being almost incomprehensibly large, to what extent does the responsibility of these changes fall on the local and state governments to coordinate and make them a reality?
Well, I think, I don't know who wants to jump in, but, under the administration of he who must not be named, there was no national policy, and cities and states had to fill in the gaps, had to do what they could. You've seen here shifting apartment buildings, away from fossil fuels. So, who wants to jump into this?
I just want to commend Amanda on her legislation, because this is, of all the issues that are facing the city in the long run, this is the most existential threat to the city of New York. We're a coastal city. We already see the flooding that, as Amanda's noted, really affects poor neighborhoods much more than rich neighborhoods. It's affecting the city. It's also affecting one of our economic engines, Lower Manhattan. So yes, of course, anything that the Biden administration can do to change environmental policy is going to be very important. But we also have to do a lot on the state level and on the city level. I think that 70% of our carbon emissions come from buildings in New York, not from automobiles. We're fortunately a mass transit city for the most part. But this is a major issue that the city has to confront, not just in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, but for the next decade or two.
I would just add quickly, it would be helpful if the city and state could agree on how to tackle those issues too. For instance, I think the governor recently put forth a proposal that would really undermine the clean buildings legislation that came out of the city council. We had some problems with that at the editorial board with the city legislation, but just punching a bunch of holes in it so that it's ineffective, which is what the governor's proposal would essentially do, just let people buy their way out of making their buildings cleaner, is just not the right way to get at it. It's just running around in circles. So the city and the state need to agree with each other and federal policy can flow through them.
You know, and if I could, I want to also sort of echo that sentiment. I agree that there needs to be more coordination, and we need to take this issue seriously, right? Like this is one of the issues that keeps me up at night. It's almost as if we all have like a collective amnesia in government about Hurricane Sandy and how it happened and how it could happen at any moment. And we are just as prepared today as we were then. And that is insane to me that almost 10 years later, we're just as vulnerable in one of the most powerful cities and states in the world. And so what that says to me is that we're actually not taking the issue seriously. And so I think we've seen some really great progress, Dolores pointed around that bill, but we've got to make sure that legislation and policies actually get to execution in a way that makes sense and how they were intended. And so the CLCPA is a great piece of legislation that's going to start 35% of all energy spending has now got to go to impacted communities first. That's a great goal, but we've got to make sure that that happens. And if it doesn't, what does it mean? How are we, I hate to use the word punishing, but how are we making sure that our policy has teeth and that there are consequences when these goals are not met? Because we do have to start really thinking seriously about how to be more than just aspirational in the race against climate change.
Ben, let me ask you, because this way I can at least throw in a school issue. Laura talking about the governor punching holes in what the city wants to do. We, of course, saw that most classically in the decision of whether the open schools go to remote learning, where he basically, the governor basically was kind of dangling the mayor. The mayor wanted to do something, he would say, you can't do that. And then, in many cases, it would get done afterwards. But there's so many issues in which we as the city are hamstrung by the state's control of what we do. Ben.
Yes, I agree.
That was easy.
Liz, I think going back to part of the discussion before, and I was happy to moderate a mayoral forum on this recently, the Albany agendas of the Albany agenda of whoever wins the mayoralty is going to be so important, but also in combination of how that person is able to build public support, build legislative support for that agenda, and just and figure out that mystery of exactly how to best work with Governor Cuomo. There's a lot of discussion in this race right now about whether you sort of let him take much more credit than Mayor de Blasio has seemingly wanted to let the governor take for things, or whether you try to build coalitions to overpower him. I mean, that's a very, very big discussion and debate happening in politics as part of this this mayoral race. So what New York City needs from state government and from Albany is immense, as we've covered in a number of ways during this conversation. And so the next strategies for that are of utmost importance.
Well, we only have about 20 seconds left. So let me just thank everybody, and that these are issues that are not going to go away. I think if we can leave people with anything, it's how complicated and how intertwined these issues are, and that systemic problems require systemic and rather than one-off solutions. That means people like Amanda, people, frankly, like Laura, who is, commenting on this, a part of the political process. We're relying on you to help us get, to help get us through to the other side. I want to thank you all. I want to thank the students in the audience, and we will see you next time on CUNY Forum. This was great. Thank you.